Oh boy, he did it again. And now it appears I've also pissed off the Horde, at least as it applies to a certain tough finalist. Welcome to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 292, Degenerates, Degeneritas, and Degenerati. It is 10 a.m. on Thursday in Miami, Florida. I'm going to be taking off to Chicago, Illinois in a few hours. So, like I said at the end of the RAXPOD last week, it's going to be a little bit touch and go with the parlays and reporting on the picks this weekend. But I'm still here to give you the audio goodness that the community has come to crave, along with its unit gains on what critics are now calling parlay donkey behavior. I'm sure the people that are actually tailing don't really give a shit what low-level cappers have to say about those things. Oh, we're going to get into who's been talking shit because some people haven't been name-dropping, some people have been in the replies, and it's all over a stupid tough fight and JP buys. We're coming off a winning weekend, so I don't know how people can complain. UFC Vegas 78 was the third profitable Apex event in a row for MMA Rax. Now, it wasn't the lofty 123 units we netted off of an assortment of parlays, courtesy of Sean Strickland and a variety of other characters, among them Elves Brenner. But UFC Vegas 77 was also a reasonably profitable event. And last weekend, I talked about taking the double, or not necessarily nothing, but just the convenient hedge that existed with the under and Khalil Roundtree being at roughly the same value. And both of those cashed in the first round, as I said they would. So, with that in mind, along with Mr. Martin Boudet, and who can forget the under courtesy of Marcus McGee and JP Buys. It was a great weekend for the MMA Lab and for MMA Rax. We'll see if both organizations can be as fortunate at UFC 292, which features Aljamain Sterling putting his title up for what is expected to be the last time, regardless of the result, against the Sugar Show, Sean O'Malley. Now, much as I dread the thought of a furry being UFC champion, it is indisputable at this point that Mr. O'Malley is no doubt nice with it on the feet. So, we're going to get into the main event, but we have an assortment of other fights to discuss first. Do have a no pick, but also in the interest of addressing the feedback that I got over this stupid tough final that is only on this prelims, mind you, because bunch of other fights on the main card got canceled and other results had to be pushed up. This was supposed to be a big poppin' pay-per-view. The return to Boston, first time in 4 years. It's a lot of returns to these East Coast cities that didn't necessarily have the capacity to bring in the UFC just because of COVID regulations or whatever the last few years. I mean, you saw that with Charlotte this year, which was also a profitable event for MMA Rax, by the way. But I spoke about it on Twitter at the time that it was indisputably good for the sport that a regional location like that did not have a lot of MMA exposure saw double the gate and an increase in attendance to almost, I think, max capacity for the arena they were in 5 years after they had last been to Charlotte in 2018. So now they're coming back to Boston for the first time since 2019, it will be interesting to see how they fill the arena out in light of the fact that they had so many other fights scheduled for this that fell through. Obviously, Cheeto was supposed to fight Cejudo. It was interesting taping the Cejudo Sterling fight. In between rounds, they made the reference to August 19th, specifically when trying to psych Cejudo up in his corner. So this date holds a lot of significance for him because it's the date that he won his coveted gold medal. So he very much wanted to compete on this date against Cheeto Vera. That was going to be an excellent fight. It is a shame that it fell through. However, I tend to agree with what Cheeto said in his press conference leading up to this event, that if he wins and O'Malley wins, it seems like a layup for the next bantamweight title matchup. I think it's rare that you see both guys so eager to get at a rematch like that, particularly when one is so highly fond of holding the result over the other because the other refuses to acknowledge that the loss truly exists on their MMA record. I don't know if it bothers O'Malley, but it's clear that he doesn't acknowledge it as a legitimate result, which is somewhat amusing, but it also speaks to his psychology, which we're going to talk about in the main event, because it's part of the reason you definitely need to, or it's at least one of the factors you need to consider in this very intriguing matchup. However, it's enough opening of a rant. Let me do one quick moment to address the Tafon and Chukwi pick, because it's pretty obvious to see what happened there. I was just kind of lazy, to be honest. I should have canceled that pick after his weight miss. In full transparency, I overlooked the fact that he was actually moving down weight, and I would have factored that into the risk in picking him, but I kept that out of the main parlays last week, and we were still profitable, so it's not the end of the world. I'm glad that I saw that risk and made the decision to hedge away from using that as a crux value and went with the under instead in the McGee buys fight. It is it's still kind of baffling that he got 30-27 in the manner that he did. But it'll be interesting to see what happens with Dobson, because he's a guy now that had so much of his MMA success in the opening 2 minutes prior to getting to the UFC. After getting to the UFC, it's been nothing but decisions, win or lose. So it'll be intriguing to monitor where he goes from here. It's a good win for him, although Nchukwi clearly, 14 months off after getting knocked out pretty brutally by Mirzakhanov, moving down a weight class. The hardest move down to make, arguably, as well, going from light heavyweight to middleweight. Nchukwi, I should have canceled the pick. So that's my bad. But, yeah. Guy moving down a weight class with over a year off, if they end up missing weight in the manner Nchukwi just did going forward, you should hedge off of that. So that was the only favorite missed last week. Otherwise, the only other pick we missed was the friend pick at under, which I'll live with trying to, or hoping that fight would have ended in more entertaining fashion than a 30-27 over Pickett, where Pickett potentially fumbled away a late finish. So it goes with Mr. Pickett. Anyway, on to UFC 292. And the first fight I'm going to discuss is the second tough final, I believe, happening. Yes, that's correct. It is Austin Hubbard and Kurt Holobaugh. All right. I shouldn't have stuck my nose in this. I don't watch Tough. This show is it's an observable disaster, okay? Like, I live in Miami, so all the Conor McGregor shenanigans with the mascot and everything happened down the street. All right? I've been hip to what is happening here. That clip of him where Stephen Thompson is just begging McGregor to like get involved is so ridiculous. It speaks to why all of the finalists for this are the veterans, because they didn't have the guy they needed coach them up the way that Chandler at least tried, put in the minimum amount of effort to. Coach Bellator Tick, as I referred to him in the Twitter discussion I had with Narco Cop MMA, who, listen, Chief, I will come on the Lambo pod and talk with you about this or any other fight you want going forward. But it's important than you and, MMA Guru and all the other cappers that were mixing it up in the replies. Pepe at least follows me, so I'm cordial with that guy. He was just asking my perspective. Most of the other people I chopped it up with were at least, willing to see my perspective, acknowledge it, if not necessarily agree with it. But there were plenty of people blowing up Narco's, reply to, ratio me or whatever. And a lot of cappers that follow me but don't necessarily show me love, even though they've got their own big shows. And I've even noticed that some of the cappers that I've been chopping it up with in the DMs with that I've, shown longtime love to have since unfollowed me. And I'm very, very hurt about it. It's important that you understand what my perspective is here because, as I said, I don't watch Tough, so I'm not emotionally invested in these fighters. I'm not emotionally invested in any of these fighters that aren't named Charles Oliveira, okay? It's very important that you understand that. I don't watch this sport as a fan. I do this on a week-by-week basis, and I get a new set of characters every week that I update my variables for, and I just look at what they illustrate, and I try to tell a story with them. That's it. I have a completely different way of looking at this than anybody else, and it's why I'm the best in the world at this. And if you don't think that I'm righteous in saying that, I will come on your show and discuss anything you want with this sport relative to betting. And we can mix it up. We can have a nice intellectual discussion that I'm sure many people will appreciate on your platform. Or you can show me some love and come on to mine. Or you can chop it up in the replies like a Neanderthal and lean on your larger platform to ratio me. And, at that point, I'll feel compelled to respond in written word very eloquently and with facts and logic because I, feel pretty good about where my side is. And at the end of the day, a lot of this is really just conjecture until the results happen. And I recognize that because I have a very long-term way of looking at this, which is why I keep it on a week-by-week basis as I just described. However, if you want to bring the written word out, I'm happy to respond. And at that point, you probably won't be able to clap back in the, fashion you want to be that'll get you the clout in terms of like, oh, this guy is an amateur relative to me. This is why you should pay for picks. Whatever, dude. Like, I feel comfortable about my sides. That's why I'm putting them out there for free. Showing my something, if you will. If you want to mix it up and, get something good out of it, I'm happy to respond. If not, appreciate the fact that I'm doing a free service while a lot of other people are asking for tips, if not outright payment for their picks, and then doing things like reverse sweeping or saying things like sharps were leaning on JP buys and then calling me a parlay donkey. This parlay donkey is up like 240, 50 units, something like that, the last 2 months. So you can kiss this parlay donkey's sweet jackass. All right. Anyway, Hubbard and Holobaugh. The reason that I reference Tough is because I haven't watched it. And I think a lot of the other people that are feeling compelled to respond to the take that I put out about it, where it would be kind of, if not disastrous, at least a black eye for the UFC if Holobaugh wins. I think there's a lot of people that are emotionally betting Holobaugh as the underdog here, when I feel like it's pretty clearly illustrated that Hubbard displays a more well-rounded skill set and, if not better, ability on the feet, at least just a better way to mix it up, and a key way here in this matchup, I think, to try to mitigate the way that Holobaugh likes to keep his combos short and tight, which is how he generates his power. It's also important to remember that Hubbard has never been finished, so there is a bit more of attrition with Holobaugh, although I don't believe he's ever been knocked out either. So I would be somewhat surprised if this fight doesn't go to decision. And with that in mind, I expect over 15 minutes in a mixed martial arts fight that we will see a mixed martial arts bout in the finale for The Ultimate Fighter. I think Hubbard understands that he doesn't have his most success when he is in a pure striking battle. That is what Holobaugh is going to want. I think there are moments that Hubbard is going to have success just because of how hittable Holobaugh is, but if that were to last over the span of 15 minutes, it would not end well for Mr. Hubbard. But we see Hubbard through the stats and through the tape just puts a little bit more on in terms of takedowns. He tries to do these drag down on top and then roll into the cage takedowns, which are really, really not good because you can surrender position pretty badly. And Holobaugh does do good damage from the top if he's not nearly as well-rounded as Hubbard in terms of ground game, just position advancement and whatnot. But I do think that Hubbard is going to have more success on the fence and will have that in terms of stalling if needed, if Holobaugh's beginning to have success with damage. But because Hubbard's never been knocked out and is younger here by 5 years, I think that it's reasonable to expect that over a 3-round fight in which Holobaugh historically has not had great success, he's going to wear out in a way that Hubbard is going to be able to capitalize. So as long as Hubbard doesn't take too much damage in the opening round, I think it's probably reasonable that Holobaugh gets the first 5 minutes. But I would expect Hubbard to get the last 10, and even if that second round is murky, the reason I put that take out there is because it makes more sense in terms of trying to salvage this season long term for one of the tough winners to be a younger guy that they can get some mileage out of, as opposed to a 36-year-old that never has won against an actual UFC in his UFC career. And it's clear that the pattern of behavior in terms of using him is that Holobaugh's just kind of been a body to them. He was acquired in the Strikeforce deal. They put him out there against a UFC veteran in Steven Seiler. He got 29-27. He was released after that. When they needed bodies for this new show that they were doing called Dana White's Contender Series, he was ready for the opportunity because he had been regularly competing in MMA, and he was, still relatively in his prime years, 31, 32, I believe at the time. And there was still some intrigue there. he got his contract on the pilot episode of the show and then got busted by the Nevada Athletic Commission for an IV violation, which is essentially what they were trying to allege Islam Makhachev did while rehydrating for the Volkanovski fight. He got caught doing that on the pilot of the successor to Tough, a show that has since become enough of a product that the UFC is trying to use Jamal Hill's status as champion as legitimacy for its establishment, that this is a way that you can become UFC champion. You can make your name on this show. The pilot of that show was put in a compromised state by Kurt Holobaugh getting caught cheating. That is why he had to fight Raoni Barcelos and Shane Burgos and Thiago Moises instead of getting beatable opponents after winning on Contender Series and then having it overturned to a no contest, even though there exists footage of Holobaugh being awarded a UFC contract because of his first round finish. That doesn't make the UFC look good. But when they're doing a season of Tough that within MMA circles is kind of known to be fated to be a failure because it's clear at this point that McGregor is all over the place, and the people that are going in there like Chandler and Thompson are doing it to try to prop it up and get paid. The UFC needs bodies again, and they need specific bodies for this team redemption, which is much, much more specific than just prospects, where you can just pretty much go grab any young, strapping fighters that you think are going to be have potential. It's more specific with the redemption arc because you have to get guys that washed out of the UFC but have somewhat bounced back in their MMA careers. And Holobaugh did that, but he did that for a Contender Series. And then the UFC said, okay, we'll honor your contract, but we're going to make you bait for 3 guys that we see much more potential in. And he got washed by all of them. So now he's back off of 2 XFC knockouts, but my point is, do you really think that they see more potential in Holobaugh at 36 than they did when he fought on Contender Series after he has done less compared to what he did prior to his second UFC run? For him personally, if he wins, it's a really, really awesome story. I won't be upset to see Hubbard lose. I wanted to make him a leg, but I recognize that because this is lower level MMA than what we're going to be seeing comparatively on the other fights in this card, I'm going to keep the pick because a lot of people are talking shit. But I'm just not going to make it a leg. So it'll be on the moonshot, and we will see what happens. But listen, if Hubbard loses, it's just another favorite loss for me that I'll have to explain away next week like I did with Nchukwi this episode. If Holobaugh wins, good for the Holobaugh hive. I see there are a lot of them on MMA Twitter this week, including gambling Twitter. And so I see that, there's an argument based on the volume and the power. I get it. And I would imagine that most of the people that are betting him watched the full season of Tough and are probably very emotionally invested in him winning. So they've convinced themselves that this is the right side. I don't think that is the case. And it goes further than the promotional angle. But the promotional angle, I believe, merits consideration here because the result is expected to go to decision. And if it goes to decision, Holobaugh doesn't have a lot of success when that happens. Hubbard does, compared to Holobaugh. So give me Austin Hubbard. I do think there's value if you want to be more aggressive with him. But because I had so much blowback, for my own amusement, I'm going to take it on the chin if he loses. But if Hubbard wins, you fucking cappers, especially if Hubbard wins by like a greasy split decision and people are mad about it, oh, you know I'm going to be talking so much shit after that fight. So please, please, please keep the replies coming. I would be happy to come on your show and talk about any of this if you're still listening, my fellow cappers. But I don't really give a shit either way because I have more fights to discuss. And with that in mind, the next fight will be Andrea Petroski and Gerald Meerschaert, Mr. GM3. So, I understand that Petroski is not necessarily the most reliable tape guy in terms of he's had his highs, his lows, and the competition hasn't necessarily been great. Wellington Turman didn't have much of a rep prior to facing him, but he did fight what people were expecting to be a less competitive fight against Randy Brown, I believe. And I do remember at least one person being upset with my declaration that Brown should have emphatically been the winner. So I'm not sure if it was a split or unanimous looking back, but regardless, I think it does say something about Petroski's ability that he beat him in more Wellington Turman in more convincing fashion than a UFC veteran like Randy Brown did. I think part of that explains why this fight is lined where it is. I also think that Petroski has an extremely similar script to winning this fight with Meerschaert that he did with Turman, because Turman himself is a guy that had good submission credentials, but Petroski did never let that threaten him in his way to establishing control time in a way that allowed him to do damage. That was also a really important result for Petroski, because I believe it was his first win in his UFC career by unanimous decision. It was. It was not his first trip to the third round. He had two of those prior in his UFC career, but he did win both of those by finish ultimately. His fight with Yao Zhang, was nearly about to go to decision, but he finished it by submission in the final 15 seconds. So his first time going to the scorecards, he got a unanimous decision. I've talked before about how it can be a bit of a front-runner thing if you see a fighter that hasn't won by... You want to see fighters that win by both finish and by unanimous decision. Outright decision wins when the fight does go the distance in the circumstances where it's, just worlds colliding and nothing necessarily breaks down. So him getting an outright result over Turman was encouraging. And he wasn't really ever in a super threatened position to get put down by Turman. So I don't expect Meerschaert to offer more of a threat here than Turman does. With that in mind, I would say if Meerschaert was to fight Randy Brown, how do you think that would go? And I know that's Randy's fighting at welterweight right now, because I know Turman moved down, so perhaps carrying the extra weight or not having to do that helped Turman out a little bit. But Petroski looked very comfortable. Meerschaert is beginning to look uncomfortable. I was at UFC 287. I made Joe Pyfer a leg when he was at like minus 180, I believe. I only lost that night because Raul Rosas did the jumping bean routine in the first round against Christian Rodrigues. But I was having a good night before that. I had a good night after that. It was an incredible experience. And part of the incredible experience was watching Joe Pyfer pound his fists on the ground like a emphatic gorilla celebrating a kill. He went off. The whole arena, his fists were echoing throughout the entire complex. It was phenomenal. And Meerschaert just did not look like he enjoyed any minute of being in there at all. He was hardly landing on him from what I remember. I don't expect Petroski to have the same immediate striking success, but if the fight goes to the ground, which is where Meerschaert wants it, I don't think Meerschaert is going to be able to do enough off of his back. He's going to need to get a sweep and then some kind of like mounted guillotine or something, but Petroski's clearly going to be the more well-conditioned and less attritioned athlete at this stage. We've just seen Meerschaert take too much damage at this point. At this stage of his career, you have to feel like he's on the way out. So Petroski, when I put the pick out, he was minus 240. He's come down a little bit to minus 220. If that keeps dropping, I'm going to have to make that a leg. But in light of the fact that I'm not going to be playing Hubbard, I am probably going to end up playing this. I might end up doing a 4-leg just because so many of the favorites are in the 200 range this week, and I am picking a lot of them. But as you've seen, my approach generally is to run with chalk, but sprinkle in some dog spots now and again. And long term, that'll help you hit some nice parlays. You're not going to win every weekend, but the weekends that you do and you load up on your confident sides, you're going to see some nice returns. So I made Petroski a leg when he fought Turman and cashed that parlay with the help of Renato Moicano and I forget who the other third leg on that was, but I believe that was UFC 281. So Petroski has been a profitable fighter here before. I feel good about deploying him here again. And it'll be interesting to see where Meerschaert goes from here, especially if he gets finished. I don't think it's out of the question that Petroski gets a submission, but I liked his ability to land some solid ground strikes against Turman. And I wonder if Meerschaert is going to respond as well if he takes like a really hard blow, like while he's getting hit from top control. So if the fight does end by finish, I'll say Petroski does it by knockout. But I think he's liable for both, not liable, but he's eligible to find a finish either way. Won't be surprised if it goes to decision, but I think he's rightly favored here in this spot. I think it's still, the appropriate value for the advantages that are in play. The next fight is Brad Katona and Cody Gibson. This is the other tough final, and so I don't get accused of literally playing favorites on both sides, even though I haven't really watched the show further than taping both of the fights that just happened. Or happened, I believe, in February and March, rather. That was when they were starting the season, and I believe when they taped, and they say the taping usually lasts 6 weeks. So I did watch the fights that Hubbard and Holobaugh had. Because the Gibson tough episode just happened this week, I didn't really watch the tough results for Katona and Gibson. I did note that it was interesting. I believe this was Austin Swain of FanDuel that pointed this out on Twitter, that Hubbard and Katona are both favored in this fight coming off of split decision wins. So it's interesting that when I heard Timur Valiev was on this show, I was even surprised that he got cut because he had a competitive fight with Jack Shore and was released off of that. So when he was announced as one of the fighters on this show, I was expecting him to win, to be honest, just because I thought he already had pretty proven experience in the UFC. And, to that point, he was one of the finalists in terms of just reaching the semifinal, although he lost the split decision. By contrast, Holobaugh got his finish in the semifinal and Gibson got one as well. But there's more advantages here that Gibson has that don't exist for Holobaugh in the numbers based on their previous UFC runs that make me think, because none of the fighters that are in this are in their 20s, all right? They're, Katona and Hubbard are both in like prime years where they potentially could be making, positive adjustments to their game, but in terms of like the range where you're making marked strides and improvements, that tends to be your late 20s stage in terms of just MMA development. So they're both that's important to keep in mind relative to their opponents as well, because Gibson's 35 and Holobaugh's 36. So the reason the stats are useful in making these predictions is because they illustrate patterns of behavior in a fight or flight situation inside the octagon over not necessarily a long-term basis individually, but you begin to see as you update the numbers fight to fight, that the numbers don't shift as much as you think they would, despite the variance of the results. So the numbers long term do really do a nice job of representing what kind of pace a fighter's going to be throwing and intercepting damage at. Although obviously that's also a product of quality of competition as well. But the point is, you can generally feel good about what kind of read Katona, Gibson, Hubbard, and Holobaugh are going to give you based on the numbers that they illustrated in their previous UFC runs that we have access to. And when you pull those numbers, outside of offensive volume and accuracy, Gibson is clearing on so many different important levels. He's going to have an over 6-inch reach advantage, 6.5, I believe. He'll be 4 inches taller. He's very tall for a bantamweight. 5'10" is pretty tall. He's got better defensive striking numbers slightly. He's got better takedown numbers. These guys are both like volume takedown shooters, but Gibson is much more efficient with his takedowns than Katona is. So if Katona is shooting, one thing that Gibson hasn't really illustrated that would be nice is a better tendency to throw low kicks. If he was better about deploying his legs as weapons on the low entries, Katona would probably be in a position to get caught with the volume of takedown attempts he's going to throw. But this is the kind of guy that will go 3 for 12 on takedowns in a fight, which will not only not look good to the judges as he gets stood up, because Gibson has the superior takedown defense in this matchup as well, but it's going to put him in a position to get hurt. And neither of these guys have ever been knocked out, but Gibson has the better finishing potential here. He has a UFC finish on his record even before the submission that he got in the tough final. Katona is kind of front-running here off the basis that his most recent result was a split decision where I don't believe we got the public results. I don't remember the reading scorecards for Hubbard Holobaugh. I just remember who was it? I'm drawing a blank on the ref, but we all know who it was. But he just went, the winner by split decision, Austin Hubbard. I would assume that he just did the same thing for Katona. So if this does go the distance, I could see them, potentially wanting to give the tough winner another encore win. So I don't know. There might be a little bit of a promo push there. That would be funny if Holobaugh wins and then Katona wins a greasy split after I said all that. But I think that Gibson, if one of these guys is going to win by finish in the tough final, it's got to be Gibson just because of the range he's going to be able to control. Watch his head defense in this fight. It's possible that we see a fight similar to what happened when Gibson fought Douglas Silva de Andrade, where Gibson got knocked down, but then made the choice to control range and prevent himself from getting hit in the head again. But Silva de Andrade just thundered away with leg kicks and was able to get a 30-27, I believe, on two of the scorecards. So if Gibson, to that point, if he's staying out of range to protect his head, you would like to see him throw more kicks, and we haven't really seen much of that from him historically. So that would be a good adjustment for him to make, but at 35, you can't bank on him to actually do that. Even so, he's the more well-rounded guy here. If this fight goes to the floor, I think he'll have an easier time getting it there on his terms as well, depending on how he wants to set up his takedowns. But watch his head defense, because Katona has been more hittable historically than Gibson has. And with Gibson having this size advantage of being good about controlling the distance against opponents that presented more of a power threat than what Katona is going to have compared to guys like Douglas da Silva de Andrade, Gibson, I think, is going to be a little bit more measured just because he's not going to be not only worried about getting hit, but he's going to be in a position where he can really, really protect his head and avoid getting damaged. So even if Katona does end up, going with more body shots or something just because it's more hittable and he ends up getting head-on strikes, I would expect Gibson to have an easier time landing damaging blows while avoiding compromising damage to at least his own face, which is the most important thing for evaluating damage relative to body shots or whatever else the judges are considering for that criteria. So Gibson is plus 135. Not a lot of dogs for me this week, so I'm going to run with that, especially because it's, a tough final, so this will make it a little bit fun. And just based on the variables I'm seeing, I'm a little bit surprised that Gibson, that it isn't a little bit line closer, but I'm glad for the value, and I will graciously take it. And we'll throw that onto some sort of 3-leg parlay and see what we can do with it. So give me Cody Gibson to upset Brad Katona and win his own tough final. The next fight is Gregory Rodrigues and Denis Tiuliulin, the man they call RoboCop. I'm going to try to make this as quick as I'm hoping this fight is going to end. Tiuliulin, I don't think is going to be able to really hang with this guy. He got completely outclassed in a way that he didn't really look like he wanted to be in there by Junyong Park. RoboCop is a guy whose stock needs to be a little bit salvaged after that Bruno Ferreira result. It was not good. And his chin has been starched, but Tiuliulin, I don't think necessarily is bringing the same kind of power that Bruno Ferreira is here. I think it is possible that he catches Rodrigues with like a kick or something, but we've seen Rodrigues get hurt and fight through it as well, even though his chin isn't the greatest. Go watch his fight with Armen Petrosian if you don't agree. He won the fight on at least one judge's scorecard in that, despite losing by split decision. Tiuliulin, by comparison, he beat Jamie Pickett and Juscelino Ferreira. Oh no, that was UAE Warriors. Sorry. Jamie Pickett is Denis Tiuliulin's only result in the UFC. He got submitted by Alishkab Kizriev in his debut last year. And that was actually on the fateful Columbus card where that was my first perfect clean sheet, and that was what set off my betting career. But I remember hedging off of that because Tiuliulin hadn't debuted, and I remember thinking, okay, one of my rules for doing this in the beginning is going to be if they don't even have a Contender Series appearance, just don't bet the fight. And I believe Alishkab Kizriev was lined at like minus 1,100 or something ridiculous, and he really performed to that. And I don't even know if that guy's fought since. He hasn't. I don't know where that guy's been, but it hasn't been in the cage. He was an 1,100 favorite, and he cleared that guy. So this guy beat Jamie Pickett. And then I believe Pickett was favored in that fight, which was gross. And I picked him, and I regret that. But I remember the Junyoung Park fight thinking Park is probably going to wash over this guy because this is a level up in competition for him. And that's exactly what happened. You're seeing that reflected again here relative to Rodrigues because of the success RoboCop has had. And when I say this is a bit of a stock redemption spot for him, it's because, the UFC clearly sees more in this guy than, what they ended up getting out of the Ferreira result, which that was two Brazilians fighting each other in Brazil. So I hardly think the UFC is salty with the outcome, although Ferreira then did get knocked out by Nursultan Thuryakbai. Oh no, that's Borat's neighbor. Nursultan Ruzaboyev. That was at Fight Night Strickland. Sorry. Since I look back on that evening so fondly. But I digress. Rodrigues knocked out Chidi Njokuani, knocked out Miley Cyrus's prom date or something. The split decision over Petrosian was tough. Knocked out Junyoung Park, who ran over Tiuliulin. Now, granted, Park was having his own success in that fight, but Rodrigues also beat Dusko Todorovic by unanimous decision. His only problem has been fighting guys that do present an early potential for power to finish him, to take his chin from him. But that's Tiuliulin. Most of his finishes... Oh no, I must be thinking of someone else that has a lot of late finishes, but he just doesn't have the punching power that Ferreira obviously did. I don't expect him to be able to put away with fists. He could do it with his legs, but if you're betting on a meme head kick, then I'm sure you're thrilled with the way the Gaethje Poirier fight ended, but you can't bank on that being the way that any given fight is going to end. So I think the under here is probably the move. Tiuliullin's only been knocked out once. It wasn't in the UFC. It was in his third MMA fight over 10 years ago. But he got finished in the first round. by Park, and he took a lot of damage in a way where he just like it didn't look like he wanted to be in there. And Rodrigues is a violent dude. I would expect Rodrigues to get this done in the first round by knockout. I do think there's submission potential there. Rodrigues has a pair of wins by armbar. They weren't in the UFC. It would be his first UFC submission win. But Tiuliulin has been submitted 4 times. He has an 0-4 submission record. So Rodrigues is going to have a presumed advantage there, even though he hasn't necessarily deployed it at this level yet. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Rodrigues win by rear naked choke. So give me Gregory Rodrigues in the first round. I'm tempted to make it a parlay leg, but we'll see how it goes. Like I said, it's going to be touch or go with the bets this week. So the picks are going out, though. The next fight is Brad Tavares and Chris Weidman. Wow. Okay, so I started out and the numbers on this said Chris Weidman should be the better one. But the numbers also said the striking was dead even, which is kind of alarming. So I already got funky vibes when I was looking at the first stage of this. By the time I looked at the second stage, the other variables, including the ring rust, dictated that Tavares was going to be the right side. So that's that much of a violent swing is usually a little bit of concern. I don't really... They're both old guys at this point. This is an obvious dog or pass spot to me. But I do worry that there's going to be too many people emotionally betting Weidman that are let down by what they see. His win, which was graded, I believe, a 29-27, it was impressive. But I believe it was in 2020. I'm forgetting the name of the fighter right now. And now I'll have to look it up because this is what I'm fated to do, or it'll drive me nuts. In 2020, Chris Weidman beat Omari Akhmedov. And he kind of, fell off from there, if we're being honest. I don't know about fell off, but his career went on more of a downward trajectory from there, and I believe he's now in the PFL. So it was an impressive win for the time, and then the leg break happened with Uriah Hall in April of next year. And now Weidman's coming back from that leg injury on top of a slew of other injuries. So he's a guy that's proven he can come back from these injuries before. Doing it at 39 is more difficult. He seems like the guy for the job, not only because he's a previous UFC champion, but again, because he has made returns from these injuries. But it's very fair to wonder where the chin is at 39, and the potential for him to get put down in flames here is just too great. Even against a guy like Tavares, who is really not presenting any sort of power threat whatsoever and would prefer this fight to be on the feet for 15 minutes. If this fight does go to the floor, I would expect Weidman to have a lot of the same success that he did against Omari Akhmedov. I don't know about finding a finish, but I just think that there's too many different ways that this fight can play out in negative ways for both sides, like alarmingly negative ways for both sides, that it's just better to stay off it. I will be happy if Tavares wins because I've graded him to win, but I'm going to be rooting for Weidman because it would be so much greater to see him. If the theme of the night is redemption, with the tough finals on the prelims. The ultimate redemption would be for the former UFC champion to at least get one more win after a fatefully tragic injury in light of his previous success over Anderson Silva. So I'll be rooting for Weidman, but I'm staying off of this fight. The next fight is Marlon Vera, the man they call Cheeto, and Pedro Munhoz. Cheeto's my guy. One of the most entertaining characters in the UFC. The guy has skull tattoos, so you know he's fun. That's why it's disappointing to see him take early rounds off in 5-round main events. It was the right play against Rob Font. It was not the right play against Corey Sandhagen. But those were 5-round events. This fight is a 3-round event. So Cheeto can't afford to come with that same lack of urgency in the first round to kind of download what his opponent is doing, because it would be unfortunate if he didn't really throw back as much while Munhoz is just, beastily chipping away with leg kicks as he's prone to doing. I've called him one of the ultimate leg kick cheesers before. That's why he was in an interesting spot against Gutierrez, because Gutierrez does so much of his best work with low kicks, and it was like, oh, he's about to meet his match against the ultimate cheeser, and Munhoz was able to overpower him quite literally with a knockdown. And to that point, he's going to have that equalizer here in terms of power that Vera does. But the thing is, most of Vera's power is with his kicks. I don't believe he actually has a one-punch knockout in his MMA career. He has a ridiculous slew of leg finishes, which is ferociously impressive in his own right. And I think that could potentially be very bad for Munhoz, because even though Munhoz was able to get a guy who was on the come up like Gutierrez, this is not a guy that's on the come up in Vera. We know Vera is a guy that is a title contender. He is merely needing a bounce back here from a close loss to a guy that is probably going to end up winning the belt at some point. He's too complete of a mixed martial artist at this stage after the Rob Font result. Corey Sandhagen will be UFC champion. So I don't hold that loss terribly against Vera, even though people are salty. It was a split decision, and a lot of people say he got dominated and were upset that he took the first round off. I think he's going to come here with a smarter game plan. Even if he does get his legs kicked a lot, this is a guy that runs a marathon every day. I mean, he's a freak in terms of cardio. I don't want to say unlimited, but the guy is as conditioned as anybody for this kind of sport. He's going to be ready to go 15 minutes if needed, but he's also going to have way more finishing upside here than Munhoz does, even if Munhoz possesses greater power, presumably, than what Cheeto is able to deploy. So I don't know if Cheeto's going to be the first person to finally crack Munhoz. It would make sense if after all this attrition and holdup that the thing that finally does him in as he gets into his late 30s is some kind of knee or wraparound kick to the back of the head. It Vera's more than live for either of those and plenty of other dynamic finishes. I can't say with confidence that he's going to finish Munhoz. I do believe that Munhoz is going to do the bulk of his damage to Vera's legs. Vera is going to do the bulk of his damage to Munhoz's face. If this goes 15 minutes, the damage will be more worn and illustrated on Munhoz than it will be on Vera. And for that reason, I do like Vera in this spot. If he swells out past the 200 range, I believe he was at 190, 185 when I called him. So he's been teetering on getting out of that. If he does float out beyond 200, I wouldn't play him. But because the pickings are so slim this week, I think I am going to end up making him a parlay leg, just because I see the path to victory here for him pretty clearly. I haven't really been super impressed by what I've seen from Munhoz on tape. I'm sure in his earlier parts of his career he had a more compelling output, but so much of what I've seen in his late fights has just been not complete. It's been almost entirely built around low leg kicks that feel like sometimes they're almost thrown out of pure frustration of not really having as much success anywhere else. And I think that is reflected in the fact that Munhoz is 1 and... Well, so prior to the Gutierrez result, he was 1-5 or 1-4 in his last 5 because the O'Malley fight was a no contest. I do think he won the first round of that because he's the best at O'Malley's greatest weakness. But if that fight was going to go another 2 rounds, it was not going his way in the second, and that's why he kind of opted out. So I don't expect to see the knockout artist that we saw put down Cody Garbrandt. I expect we see the more traditional Munhoz we saw prior to the Gutierrez upset. That is almost entirely reliant on low leg kicks and finds himself very mitigated by a fighter that is more built around damage and should fight with a greater sense of urgency that he has recently in light of the fact that this isn't a 5-round main event in which he's fought 3 straight. So give me Cheeto. The next fight is Mario Bautista and Damon Blackshear. Okay, that twister was nice. I thought about putting out a pick on Jose Johnson, or the Damon Blackshear Jose Johnson fight last week, rather, when Johnson got rebooked. However, I was just too lazy because it got rebooked late, and Blackshear opened as like a. He closed, I think, at the 200 range, but I feel like I saw him at 300 at some point. I could be misremembering that. But in any event, it was like, no, I already know what my sides are. I don't need this. And I went 8 for 10, so I didn't really need to incur any more risk than I already had at that point. However, this is a bit different. Blackshear, to his credit, is going to go in and do another weight cut. He was at 136 last week, so I don't know how much he rehydrated. He's confident he's going to make the bantamweight limit, so it'll be interesting to see how that goes. But assuming he's able to do it, I do think that he's got some ways of making this fight competitive. I do think he will probably need to finish this fight in the first round if he wants to win. And I think that him chasing those finishes is going to put him in a position where a more polished, experienced, technical guy like Bautista that is more just about taking what his opponents give him rather than opening up pursuing a path to victory he has in mind. I do think that Bautista is going to be able to find mistakes that Blackshear makes and end up getting a finish, whether it's in the first or the second round. Well, something I use in terms of Tate to keep in mind relative to making that point about Blackshear is if you go back and watch the Farid Basharat fight, which I think shows a very clear path to victory for Bautista, if the fight does end up going the distance, that was very nearly going to be a 30-27 for Basharat, who was making his UFC debut. I believe Blackshear might have filled in for that on short notice himself. So, he's a guy that's ready to go, to his credit. It shows good heart. But Blackshear in that fight, similar to what just happened against Johnson, he had Basharat in a twister position at one point, and he ended up losing it. Basharat never threw the back elbow the way that Jose Johnson did, that Blackshear very acutely trapped. But there were times in the fight where Blackshear was trying to trick Basharat. The commentary team picked up on that, and Basharat was too hip to the tricks that were happening, and because of the risk that Blackshear incurred in trying to make those tricks against the cage successful, it put him in a position where he was more easily able to be taken down. And we know something that is something that Bautista is going to really try to have a lot of efficient success with, regardless of who his opponent is, because his submission skills are so sharp in his own right. So this is a level up in competition for Blackshear. When that happened against Farid Basharat in a fighter that was making his debut, he got 30-27, and it wasn't a 30-27 on the scorecards because in the final 10 seconds of the fight or so, Blackshear threw up an extremely vicious arm triangle that nearly trapped Basharat and was able to swing the round. I don't think you could make a case for Blackshear nearly finishing the fight prior to that, but he absolutely stole the round in the final 10 seconds by nearly putting it away at the end. Otherwise, it would have been a 30-27 and a much more visibly dominant win. There is finishing upside for Blackshear here. I don't like this at all if this goes the distance for him. Because of that, Bautista, I think, is more well-rounded ways of winning and is going to be in a more fresh position, if not necessarily relative to a combat experience, not having to go through a second grueling weight cut, but still coming into this fight very confident, given the high-level UFC success he's had, and being twice as experienced as Blackshear is. So I like Mario Bautista here a lot. He's sitting at 220, so that feels like very, very playable range to me. I recognize the opportunity that Blackshear is going to have to win this, but I don't think that a guy like Bautista, who has so much good momentum right now, had one of the best 2022s last year of any UFC fighter, if we're being honest. I think he keeps the good times rolling. I hope he gets another fight before the end of the year. I hope it's a really legitimate opponent. I mean, bantamweight is so deep. And I was saying it last year that this guy is going to be another name to watch. And I think that if he's able to get a strong finish here on Blackshear, that'll only be reinforced. So give me Mario Bautista. The next fight is another late fill-in. It's Ian Garry and Neil Magny. It's too bad Jeff Neal pulled out. Although Jeff Neal's been somewhat of a terrorist for my picks, he killed my Luque pick of him a year ago, and then I was, UFC. I think it was 283. Was it 285 that Jones fought at? I can't remember which one it was, but my goodness. I was, no, it wasn't 283. 283 was Brazil. Was it 284? Who knows? I was so 286. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I was gonna make the plus 1.5 on Jeff Neal Shavkat Rakhmonov my parlay leg for that night instead of the Ian Garry Song Kanon minus 2.5, and the weight miss freaked me out so bad for Jeff Neal that I was like, oh, I don't know if Shavkat's going to finish this in the first half. I should hedge off of this. And it still ended up clearing. And that just ended up being one of many early to go on bad breaks with reading weight misses this year. And then watching Garry get nearly dropped by Song Kanon, it was so liberating. It was like, oh, I recognize that this guy has the chin hazard, but no one's really been able to exploit it yet. And then Garry won by knockout in the final minute instead of the opening 2.5 rounds. I missed out on quite a few units that night because of that. So Jeff Neal is somewhat of one of my new boogeymen in this sport. Seeing him go away makes me feel somewhat good just because he's replaced by a guy who, from a betting standpoint, is a bit more predictable in Neil Magny. I've had plenty of success before with Magny overs, as I alluded to earlier in the show with my successful UFC Columbus. One of the good picks I had that night was Neil Magny 2.5 over, I believe it was Eric Gordon. No, not Eric Gordon. Max Griffin. Why did I say Eric Gordon? I have no idea. I totally pulled that out wrong. Max Griffin. I should know who Max Griffin is because we just faded him thanks to Michael Morales at UFC Vegas 76. So my memory isn't totally shot. But Neil Magny is an over machine. And he's getting a guy in Ian Garry as an opponent that has had his own share of decisions already in the UFC against lower-level fighters than Magny, including Darian Weeks, who's no longer on the roster, and Gabe Green, who promptly got into a trading exchange with Brian Battle at UFC Charlotte, and you saw how that went. And was very, very close to going to a decision against Song Kanon before he turned it up at the end of that one in what would have been a 29-28. He put Rodrigues away very quickly, but Rodrigues had kind of been all over the place prior to that matchup in May. So it's seeing him come back this quickly is good. And Garry, he should win this fight. But the number on his head here is just way, way too big. Even if the number were in the 300 range for me, it would be too big here. There's been a lot of overestimation. He was lined as a 300 favorite against Gabe Green and went to unanimous decision. So if you're betting a guy at that range, I think you need to be expecting a finish. I don't know if he's going to find a finish here just because of how determined Magny is to go the distance every time he's in there. Garry has a lot of tools to give Magny problems in areas that Magny likes to be successful. I made a reference to them both enjoying a good cage clinch. Garry likes to be in there because he can just stand up straight and wall you off and then throw knees at your head while standing straight up. Like his his dexterity to be able to land standing clinch knees, it's like getting hit with an elbow that you can't see because it's coming as an uppercut against the fence. He's very, very good at deploying them, even though he hasn't necessarily knocked anybody out with it yet. So I expect him to hurt Magny in the clinch, but the longer they're closer to the fence, the more Magny I just expect to tie it up to not give Garry the opportunity to strike and just make it dirty on the fence in the same way he just did against Phil Rowe. And he was able to squeak out a split decision in that fashion. I don't know if Magny's going to win. Especially if it goes to decision, I could see him probably losing a split, even if it feels like he's going to win. And I would imagine the underdog bettors in that scenario would be pretty devastated. Garry is going to lose at some point. Somebody's going to end up catching his chin too, because even though he's never been put down, he's never been knocked out. We've seen him get floored by guys that he should be putting down himself. Somebody's going to touch his chin. It's probably not going to be Neil Magny, who has not won a fight in the UFC by knockout since against Craig White in 2018. He's, in fact, only had 2 wins by knockout across 17 UFC appearances since 2018. Oh, I'm sorry. Since 2016. I feel very good about this going at least past the halfway point. I'm surprised that this isn't a plus 2.5, but that kind of overperception, I think, of Garry's finishing ability at this level has put that line where it is. So Magny's got chin concerns, there's no doubt. He got knocked out during that run I just referenced by Santiago Ponzinibbio and Lorenz Larkin. But only one of those was in the first round. So Garry should win. Late finish is on the table. 3rd round knockout. Decision win, most likely, I would think. And because of that, the plus 1.5 looks very good to me. So I'm going to be juggling between that and the minus 1.5 for the Rodrigues Tiuliulin fight in terms of which one I think is more likely to happen. Rodrigues really should put him away. I just know that Tiuliulin, to his credit, hasn't been knocked out multiple times. So you want to go with more proven commodities, and we've seen it proven at this point that Magny will drag things out for as long as he needs to on a very regular basis against guys that are at least as skilled as Garry, even though he's been finished by ranked fighters before. But maybe we see some submission ability from Garry finally, because he does have 1 submission win on his record, I believe. There was a rear naked choke in his 3rd MMA fight, but haven't seen it in the UFC yet. So be interesting to see where this fight goes, if it hits the floor, but I expect a lot more of it to be on the fence than I think some people may be expecting. Mostly because Magny, I would think, is going to put up more resistance. But I also thought he'd put up more resistance against Gilbert Burns, and we saw how that went. So give me the plus 1.5. Give me Ian Garry to win. I won't bet Ian Garry money line, obviously, but I do feel pretty good about that plus 1.5 if you want to take that. So, and now we've come to the main event. Aljamain Sterling and Sugar Show Sean O'Malley. Oh boy. So I was pretty emphatically on Sterling to beat Cejudo He was the underdog in that fight. So if you remember that, which was a devastating night, by the way, because I missed out on over 100 units of profit due to an under, the Ribeiro under being like 90 seconds off or something when he fought Joseph Holmes. So I was watching the whole night as a fan, but I was grinning the whole time, especially when Sterling won, because that was a big, like, what side are you on fight, kind of like this one. Well, it's not necessarily the same though, because Sterling Cejudo was a hard pick 'em the whole time. So that one was really like, whose side are you on here? And Sterling, I believe, was the underdog for most of the time the lines were out. So I had a very strong grade on him, and so I was happy to see him as the underdog somewhat. So I really do try to keep an objective spin on this from fight in and fight out, which is why I was optimistically surprised when I did the initial screening for this and O'Malley came back as my winner. And then I went and I did a little bit more digging in terms of technical traits, and O'Malley still remained my winner. He's very, very clearly going to have the striking edge almost everywhere. We see Sterling's defensive numbers are a little bit better, but offensive volume he absolutely clears. Power he absolutely clears. And I know that, I made the case earlier that, even though that's what people are banking on Holobaugh winning over Hubbard by, it's important to remember that Holobaugh doesn't have the same overall polish in other areas that O'Malley does. I do think that the MMA lab at this stage is probably a better gym than Sterling having Sarah Longo fight team. We'll see how the night goes for them with Chris Weidman fighting first. But I think you've seen the recent success from the MMA lab with guys like Jared Cannonier and Marcus McGee. There's a lot of UFC roster guys in there that are giving a high level of competition, and O'Malley is at the front of that operation. I think it's not out of the question that we see MMA Gym of the Year go to them at the end of the year in the same way that it went to Fortis MMA at the end of last year. I'm already looking very favorably at that relative to other gyms. It's one of the reasons why I felt good about picking McGee to put buys out early last week. Now, Sterling's more experienced and has far less ring rust. Those are important considerations here. But Sterling is also in a position where he's openly admitted that he's essentially going to be relinquishing the belt regardless of the result. He's not going to be champion for very long, if at all, after this fight, because he's going to featherweight. He's determined to do that. He's said it multiple times. He said it immediately after he beat Cejudo, and he's maintained it through this press run. And for how aggressive his weight cutting is, you have to understand. So O'Malley's the younger fighter. The bigger promotional draw by far in terms of casuals. Part of the problem the UFC has had with Sterling is that there's many hardcore fans that dispute his status as champion still because of the theatrical drama under which his belt was first obtained. And then you can make a case that he lost to Peter Yan. But you could make it, but it was a very close fight. You could make a case for either one of them winning, I think. Sterling has already kind of let this go. He's looking forward to the next thing. This is just kind of the next stepping stone for him, but he still wants this. And he's a champion, and he has a championship mindset in terms of preparation. So you know he's going to come correct, but that kind of hunger that you need when you haven't been champion before, that you know a guy like O'Malley has, that you're hearing in terms of how he is carrying and exuding himself to try to hold himself to that standard to get to that level, it just isn't there the same way. So I'm not... And Sterling is a guy who's, had that kind of bailout mentality in the past. Just referencing the Jan fight, for example. Although in that case, it was, Jan illegally kneed him. It's pretty evident that he deserved to be disqualified. But, there's traditionalists that will say, oh, Sterling, he could have fought through it or whatever. I'm not going to speculate on that. But my point is, in comparing the psychology of these two, one of them is a champion but is ready for the next chapter, and the other carries themselves as a champion but recognizes they still need to go earn that, and recognize that in their last bout they were pushed to a place that they didn't have to go to before. So I think the Jan fight really brought the best out of O'Malley. I think he'll end up being stronger for it. And I'll be honest, too. I picked Jan to win, and I shouldn't have played him because I didn't have a strong enough grade over him and was concerned about the O'Malley promo push angle relative to Jan. But watching that fight again this week, I mean, it's very evident that O'Malley won the final round. I think what mostly leaves people in dispute about who won the fight was a moment in the first round in which Jan appeared to be slamming O'Malley. However, and just speaking to kind of the savant mentality that O'Malley, or his personality rather, that he exudes, as he was about to get slammed on the mat, the audience and the judges all see Jan lift him up. But then what the judges see more easily that the audience doesn't, and the audience remembers the visual of O'Malley being lifted, is O'Malley, before he hits the floor, actually kind of turns his torso over and pushes his hands into the canvas to brace his landing. And because of that, he actually doesn't get slammed in. He gets taken down in a dramatic fashion, but he doesn't get slammed in a way that you would think would do damage, and in a way that would be technically considered damage by the rule set. And so because that moment has a perception of being a slam by the casual audience, but was actually a braced takedown by O'Malley, and O'Malley did do damage in other areas of the round prior to being taken down like that, you can make a case for O'Malley winning the first round. And I think that most casual fans that remember the visual of Jan lifting him up and not actually getting the slam component of the slam would dispute that, which is what I did at the time. Upon rewatch, that key detail I think is enough for me to leave enough benefit of the doubt for O'Malley winning the first round. So and to O'Malley's credit, when the result was read, he said he wasn't sure if it was going to go his way. It was a humbling moment for him. he went back to his corner and his head was down on the stool at the end, and he was probably thinking, did I do enough to win? Is this going to be a legitimate loss for me? And he got out by the skin of his teeth. And then, he rewatched the fight, and a day later on Twitter, he's like, oh, I knew that I was going to win. Fuck you. And I'm like, I don't know. All right. I definitely won. 30-25. Okay. All right, Chief. But I'm not upset with him winning upon rewatch. I was furious when I was initially watching it, but I can understand it upon rewatch. And I think he will be better for it. He protects his head better. This is going to be a highly intriguing striking battle just because Sterling doesn't really throw in super abundant volume. Both guys have really excellent, constantly stance-switching footwork, so it's going to be fun to watch them literally dance with each other. And both of them often will fight with their guard down, but Sterling is a bit sloppier in deploying that, and he also doesn't throw a lot of combos. If you watch the Cejudo fight, almost all of his striking success came with 1-2s, many of which were set up with ones that were kicks. So against a much larger opponent that is a much more sophisticated striker than even him or his previous opponent in Cejudo, I don't know if Sterling is going to be able to have as much success. By contrast, O'Malley's a guy that can put out a 5-punch combo and any one of them can put your lights out. And he's got the kicks. Now, if this fight goes to the ground, Sterling is going to presumably be able to do a lot of damage. It would be interesting to watch O'Malley get triangled and see how he would deal with that kind of adversity. But one of the things I bring up with the camps that I think is important here is that O'Malley, even the commentary team talks about how almost all he does at his camps at this point is drill grappling and takedown defense, because he knows that that's how people are going to be trying to take him out, and he has to be ready to get out of that to put the fight back on his terms. O'Malley is building himself up to be bantamweight Israel Adesanya. This feels like a passing of the torch moment, even though Sterling doesn't really want to acknowledge it as such. I can understand it because it on a certain level, it doesn't feel like O'Malley's really done enough to get this shot. People were wondering if he even belonged fighting Jan prior to fighting Jan, and then I think the surprise of the split decision drove home the narrative that, oh, this guy doesn't really belong here. There's a lot of different people, including Volkanovski, that think O'Malley's one of, if not the best striker in the UFC. Volk didn't say he's the best striker in the UFC. He said he's one of the best strikers in the UFC. I think O'Malley's blend of power with his length advantages in this weight class, you can make a case that he is the best striker in the UFC. If he puts down Aljamain Sterling, that won't be in dispute. In a 5-round fight, it'll be interesting to see how O'Malley goes. But I do think that if he's able to get 3 rounds of landing more damage on Sterling, that he's going to be in a position where the judges want to give him this. And it'll be interesting to see how Sterling does in the later rounds, because although Sterling was able to ultimately secure the 4th round over Cejudo, he did let the 5th round get away from him. And O'Malley, even though I hold the split decision loss against him relative to final round performance, if you go look at the actual scorecards, he won the final round on all 3. It was one of the reasons he was able to get a split. So his final round performance through this point to his career, I don't actually believe that he's lost one. We just saw Sterling lose the 5th round to Cejudo. So I would be intrigued about this fight if it's 2-2 going into the 5th. At that point, I think you have to side with the guy who's going to have the power and striking speed advantages as well as volume, given the fight starts on the feet. So I'm surprised this isn't lined closer to a pick'em, to be honest. The way that the way that Sterling's fight with Cejudo was, but it's going to be interesting if Sean wins if you get him at a price tag like this again, plus 200. If Sterling is out of this weight class and Sean is sitting at the top with the belt, especially if he knocks him out of the weight class quite literally, it's going to be, I think, a little bit before you're able to find someone that can crack the confidence O'Malley's exuding relative to the striking success he's had. So I only have one other underdog this week, and it's Cody Gibson, which is why I was happy to do the late pick and grade on him, even though that result came through earlier this week on the Tough episode. But in addition to riding with that dog, I am going to be going with Sugar Show. I'll be content with the result either way. I'll be happy to watch what's a very intriguing main event, but I'll be kind of approaching it with the similar mentality I did when Sterling fought Cejudo, which is I'm taking the side that has more value from a fiscal standpoint on a number that we might not necessarily get again in the near future. It would be interesting to see Sterling moving up to featherweight if you got him at a minus 105 number like you did against Cejudo. You're not getting it against Sean O'Malley. So give me Sugar Show. I'm looking forward to the main event. I got to go get a haircut, and then I got to get on an airplane. So it's been a thrill. Before I do both of those things, I have to finish editing this and put it in a video format with the timestamps and everything. So I've been writing them down here, and I'm going to go do that right now. But I want to thank all of you very much for tuning in to another episode of the MMA RAXPOD. And we'll be back next week for, like I said, this is a week-by-week basis, so I don't have these off rip. Next week is, it's UFC Singapore. Oh, let's go. And that's big, too. Max Holloway, Korean Zombie. Not only because Korean Zombie retirement fight, but in light of what's going on in Hawaii, it's going to be an emotional performance for Max Holloway. So I'm looking forward to it. Plenty of other matchups I see that'll be worth examining from a betting perspective. But thank you very much for tuning in this week. And I'm not going to be able to watch UFC 292, but I hope you all enjoy it. And I look forward to catching the replays while I'm inevitably delayed at O'Hare International Airport on Sunday. So thank you very much, and take care.